Welcome to International School of the Word. My name's Matthew Foley, and I will be your instructor in this Greek 101 class. I want to start off by some basic facts concerning Greek. First of all, for people who have not been familiar with it at all concerning biblical teachings or studies, what is biblical or Koine Greek? And where does it come from? Why is it in the Bible? Well, I'd like to say first of all, when you hear the term Koine, it's actually common. It means common from the Greek of Jesus' era. And there's a differentiation between different types of Greek. Koine is a particular type of Greek from the time period of Jesus that was used to write the New Testament. Now, I want to talk about simple answers as to why it is important for Christians today to learn Koine Greek. We're very blessed to have the Bible written in current English. We have phenomenal translations. But however, there are certain linguistic modes, certain ways of thinking that you find in the original Greek, in the Koine Greek, that you won't be able to completely translate over into English. For instance, verb tense. In English, our tenses in our verbs are chronological. We have past tense, I did something. Present tense, I do something. Future tense, I will do something. This was not exactly common among many ancient languages. And in Greek, tense is not primarily about chronology. It's about the aspect of the action, how the action was done. Now, that's a little bit hard, especially for someone coming into Greek for the first time to understand. But it's important that you know that's just a good example that Greek is different than English, and that it will help you, if you study Koine Greek, to better understand the teachings of the New Testament. Now, I was once told that learning Greek was no longer a necessity for students of Scripture because the aid of word studies and concordances, I was told, was good enough to give you the deep details of the original language and the grammar, and that you didn't really need to learn the original language. Now, although word studies and concordances are very helpful, it just doesn't compare to learning the original Greek. In fact, I've found that with studying the original language, you get better insights concerning what the concordances and word studies are trying to say. You can quickly get misconceptions from those tools if you do not know the original language well enough to use them properly. Now, there are things that you simply can't appreciate about that language unless you've studied it. Now, Jesus is Jewish. I don't know if you knew that, but he is. So why is his gospel written in Greek and not Hebrew? Can the gospel be properly understood as a Jewish document if it is written in Greek? Especially with the Old Testament, the whole of it, being written in Hebrew. We here at ISOW, we partake in the Jewish roots movement, and we firmly believe in returning to a lost aspect of the gospel and of the New Testament, which can only be found in Judaism and in the Jewish roots movement, returning to the ideas and the ways of thought that you find in the first century Jewish community. Now, the gospel being written in Greek has at times been thought of as a departure from Jewish thought, but that's not necessarily true. Every language has its ways of forming thought, and you will have different ways of forming thought, as I said before, in English compared to Koine Greek. Greek is not Hebrew. However, that does not mean that Jews did not find a way to impart their ways of thinking, their sensibilities, into this language. The Greek of the New Testament has, in a significant sense, been made Jewish while not having come from Judea locally. This first lesson, is primarily about how Greek entered into Samaria and Judea, the Jewish context of Jesus' day. This area, by the way, this location of Samaria and Judea, in scholarship it's referred to as Palestine because at that time period the Latins referred to it as Palestina, and in Greek it's Palestine. How did we get from the Hebrew of Malachi, the last prophet of the Old Testament, to the Greek of the New Testament? Great mystery. Well, during about a 400-year period, called the intertestamental period. Between the Old Testament, Malachi, the last prophet, and the New Testament, John the Baptist's coming onto the scene, there were some historical events that took place that shifted the entire ancient Near Eastern landscape. I'm going to start with a name that probably everyone hearing this lesson will recognize, Alexander the Great. But it really starts with his father, Philip II. Philip II was an emperor of Macedonia, and that's located about the area of modern-day Macedonia and Greece. Now, here on this map, you see the location of ancient Macedonia when Philip first took it from his father, from the person that preceded him, This is a pretty small location compared to how it would be at the end of his reign. And he had a particular vision, a little idea with what he wanted to do with this plot of land. He wanted to take Hellenistic or Greek culture and impart it into an empire that would cross the known world. Now, a lot of people wonder, because Greek was not local to Macedon, why did Philip adopt this language into his culture in order to spread it across the known world? Why did he favor it? Well, the particular dialect of Greek that Philip II adopted was called Attic Greek. And it was a language that he used for government, schooling, and overall societal functions. Attic Greek was used in Athens, which by the 5th century BC demonstrated the peak of culture in the ancient world.
We will resume this teaching after a short message from International School of the Word.
This teaching is one lesson taken from a full course on ISOW.org. If you are enjoying this video, we invite you to check out the full course in the links below. For the best value, try our All Access Pass. At just $99 per month, you can access thousands of hours worth of high-quality, world-class teaching. To check local pricing in your country, visit ISOW.org. For more great teachings like this, be sure to subscribe to this channel and follow us on our social media platforms.
Now, back to this teaching from International School of the Word.
The kind of people that we would have in Athens at that time period were Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Greek thinkers that influence academia and even theology to this day. And so the language that they spoke, Attic Greek, became this language which implied or had a sense of order to it and thoughtfulness. So you can see clearly, because of where it came from, why Attic Greek would be adopted by Philip II for his empire. This is a cool picture right here. We have Plato represented here, and we have Aristotle as well. Now, Philip II was a great military strategist. However, that didn't keep him from being assassinated. In 336 BC, he was killed, and his son Alexander took the throne from him. The size of the empire after Philip's death, as you can see here, was massive compared to when he initially took it. He did a great job expanding it, but he wouldn't do anything compared to what his son Alexander would do. Alexander the Great, at the age of 20, conquered and thus united the entirety of the Greeks. He too carried his father's vision to Hellenize the known world and to spread Attic Greek as a primary language. Now, let's see here. By 332 BC, Alexander had taken Judea and Samaria, or Palestine, from the Persian Empire, which had it beforehand, who also took it from the Babylonian Empire before them. And Alexander was pushing the Persians back into their home region. The Jews of Palestine would retain Aramaic, speaking it as a common language, from their time being under the Persian Empire. And so, with Alexander the Great coming in, there was a slow infusion of Hellenization, that's Hellenistic culture, Greek culture in general, and the Greek language itself into the Judean and Samarian scene. Now, under Alexander's rule, Attic Greek spread throughout the regions of Asia Minor, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and Persia, even all the way into India. This was the beginning of Greek becoming the common language of the era. As you can see here, this is the spread of Alexander's empire. You can compare it to when it was only in the region around Greece and Macedonia, compared to spreading from that region all the way across the ancient Near East. Greek in Judea and Samaria, or Palestine. Upon Alexander the Great's death, his empire was divided among his 4 generals, and this was foretold by the prophet Daniel, 2 of which battled over the region of the Jews. These 2 were Seleucus in southern Mesopotamia, and north of Samaria and Judea was Ptolemy, who ruled the region of Egypt. So here we have Ptolemy and Seleucus' empires. Ptolemy was the first one who had maintained control over the land of Judea and Samaria. This, of course, was after Alexander had died in 301 BC. The Ptolemies, the dynasty of Ptolemy, ruled the Jewish lands initially, as I said, though this would not last forever. The Jews were treated rather well. However, some Jews were transplanted from their native land into the city of Alexandria in Egypt to assist in populating it. They were basically recruited by Ptolemy, the emperor, and Ptolemy II, and put into Alexandria to have diverse populations building up in the city. And these people, naturally, because they were taken out of Palestine or Samaria and Judea, and they were put into Egypt, began to not use Hebrew as a common language or Aramaic as a common language, but began to adopt Greek, as Egypt at the time was being ruled by a Greek empire. And as this continued, Ptolemy II, who was ruling over Alexandria, he ordered that a Greek translation of the Old Testament, which at first it was at least the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah, was to be undertaken, that would accurately transfer the sensibilities of the Hebrew people into Greek. This would be called the Septuagint, which is abbreviated as LXX. This was so that the Jews who were abroad, as well as those specifically in Alexandria, Egypt, could remain connected to their ancient faith. Those Jews who were among the nations certainly adopted Greek and were more open by necessity of trade and life. They couldn't survive unless they took on Greek. They didn't really have a choice, but it wasn't necessarily something that they were bitter about, because they weren't bitter about taking over Aramaic. It was just a part of life. And this changing from one culture to another, specifically the Greek culture, is what we call Hellenization, which is basically the adoption or interaction with Greek culture to one degree or another. Those Jews who were still in their native land resisted this Hellenization more than their counterparts outside of Judea and Samaria. And naturally, if you're speaking Aramaic and Hebrew, and you have a resistance against Greek and any new language, and the Jews were, being a monotheistic culture, they were very resistant to outside interposition, to outside entrance into their culture. So whenever the inland Palestinian Jews, or those Jews that dwelled in Judea and Samaria, were first introduced to Greek, certainly there was resistance to it. But over time, of course, just like those Jews who were outside of that land, they had to adopt it for trade and life. And because of the Septuagint, eventually even religious purposes. Now, it is important to note that those Jews who were in the land of Judea and Samaria were unified in their identity, oftentimes a little bit more than those Jews who were abroad in the nations, because they had the customs that they maintained in the synagogues that were really strengthened by the presence of the temple in the land. However, that does not stop the Greek influence from rolling on and growing stronger. There's this particular town called Marissa that has been excavated, found in the land of Sumeria and Judea and Palestine. And it's a big part, archaeologically speaking, of how we know that Jewish people began to adopt Greek customs and practices. In the city of Marissa, which was 21 miles or about 34 kilometers southwest of Jerusalem, it was a town that reflected Greek enculturation. One aspect of Marissa was that it was often more Greek than Jewish, especially in where its marketplace was located. The marketplace was in the center of the town rather than at the city gates. And in ancient Israelite cities and in Jewish cities, it was more common for their marketplace to be outside the city gates so that travelers, when they came in, could have more access to it versus having it at the center of the city, which was common among the Greeks. This is one evidence of Hellenization within the Jewish lands. Another evidence at Marissa was an inscription in Greek found that was talking about a certain official who was over the marketplace. And this was a really early example of Greek being used in the daily life of the Jewish people. Even Greek decorations and styles, artistry I mean, were found within tombs decorating where people were buried. And it really demonstrated all of these things, the location of the marketplace, the decoration in the tombs. These were indications that the Jewish people stopped looking towards the east, Persia, Babylon, for enculturation to be more cultured. They started looking towards the west. So history shifted its direction as the Greeks were looking to influence the peoples of the ancient Near East. So the people in the ancient Near East adversely looked toward the Greeks. These are examples of different areas in which Jewish people were Hellenized. It is likely that Jews had less animosity towards the Greeks during this time than they would have soon. And when I mean soon, I mean just a few years. Give it a few hundred years. Something is going to happen that will radically change the feelings of the Jewish people towards Greek culture.
Thank you so much for supporting our ministry. If this has blessed you, please say a prayer for us. And if you would like to give, we have 3 ways that you can do that. You can give online at isow.org/donate, or text the word GIVE and the amount to 423-225-9022. That's 423-225-9022. You can also give through the mail at ISOW, 340 Paul Huff Parkway, Northwest, Cleveland, Tennessee, 37312. Thank you. God bless you, and may the Lord multiply your seed. Now back to this teaching from the International School of the Word.
In 198 BC, the Seleucid ruler Antiochus III pushed out the Ptolemies from Samaria and Judea and took the region. Now, he was a fair-minded person, and he let the Jews live in relative peace, much like how the Persians let them live in peace. However, the dreaded Antiochus IV Epiphanes ascended to the throne among the Seleucids in 175 BC, and he began military campaigns with the goal of taking over Egypt. In 168 BC, after encountering Roman powers who stopped his attempt to conquer Egypt, he took out his fury on Jerusalem, plundering and implementing a volley of ghastly legal restrictions, unparalleled in the history of Grecian rule. And it's made him well known even to this day for his cruelty, especially among the Jewish people. What you see here at the top is a depiction of Antiochus Epiphanes. To give you an example, to speak more about what laws he implemented that restricted the Jewish people, he made observance of the Torah illegal, the Jewish law completely illegal. He banned any Jewish literature upon pain of death from being, they burned all the Jewish literature. Sabbath and circumcision were forbidden, and Jews were forced to eat unclean animals. He took that which was holy and made it unholy. He even set up in the Holy of Holies an altar to Zeus. These horrors caused an anti-Grecian force to rise up among the Jews, the Maccabees. The Maccabees overthrew Antiochus, cleansed the city and the temple, and rededicated it. And on that day, the 25th of Kislev in 164 BC, it was the establishment of Hanukkah, or Hanukkah. When the Maccabees became the ruling family afterwards, they and their dynasty became known as the Hasmoneans, which Herod will marry into, Herod's dynasty, of which we talk about in the New Testament. And under the reign of the Hasmoneans, an anti-Hellenization religious movement of Jews called Hasidism was reinvigorated. And from this group, the Pharisees of Jesus' time would come. In 63 BC, the Romans took over Judea and Samaria, and they built and expanded the region greatly, bringing their advancements and ingenuity with them. They maintained Hellenistic influences and themes during their rule, but they were far fairer than Antiochus was, far kinder to the Jewish people. But after that damage was done, it clearly shocked the Jewish people to the point that they would have distrust of the Romans because of how the Greeks treated them. And the similarity between the Grecian culture, which was much of it adopted by the Romans, probably didn't help things out for the Jewish people. So it is important to note the divide of languages in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire in the West spoke Latin commonly. So we see here in the West, and this is from the 5th century, a map from later on, but this was true at the time of Jesus' day. So in the West, we have Latin spoken, not only among aristocracy, among leadership, but it was more of a common language and a common mode of communication. While in the East, you had common, Koine Greek, which was similar to the function of Latin in the West. Now, people who speak Latin in the West and the East would be more like Roman officials who came locally from some Western region and came to serve the government in the East. So when you see the Passion of Christ, it's probably not likely that Roman guards would be speaking Latin to one another, unless, of course, they came, two guards that came locally from Rome and they were stationed in Jerusalem. But it's more likely that common Roman soldiers and the local people of the region that was under the rule of the Romans spoke Greek in the East. Now, you want to talk about how languages were spoken in the daily life of Jesus, just like, unlike in the United States where people generally only speak English, in other nations across the world where you have multiple languages, they're multilinguistic, you're going to have different languages spoken for different reasons. The vast majority of people speak English in the world for trade, while they speak their own dialect, specifically for communication with family, for their culture, their community. And in that case, in Jesus' day, it's very likely that Aramaic was a common street lingo, and it was used for commercial purposes also between the peoples who were ruled by the Romans. But when they spoke to a Roman soldier, or in many cases when they're trading from people with people from Greece, or the little bit closer to them in the East or the West that speak Greek rather than Aramaic, they would have used Greek. So it's very likely that those people who were traders, and Jesus' family, being carpenters, were traders, would have been able to speak Greek, and yes, would have been able to speak Hebrew, especially in a religious context. Important Jewish texts that have been translated into Greek by the Jewish people. It is important to note the translation of some text by the Jews into Greek, because these particular texts and their importance in the Jewish community indicate, with their being translated into Greek, how important or practically speaking, how usable the Greek language was, that it wasn't necessarily this unclean language associated with this Antiochus of Epiphanes. It was still something that could be used in the Jewish community. We have, for instance, 1st Enoch, an intertestamental text. It's a series of writings in Aramaic that were collected and compiled into 1st Enoch in the intertestamental period during the 3 centuries before Christ's birth, and they were later translated into Greek. Sirach, or the Wisdom of Ben Sirah, written by Joshua ben Eleazar ben Yesirah between 196 to 175 BC. These texts written by Sirach, where it was in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Sirah. So you say the word Sirach, that's just a Greek form of the Hebrew Sirah, for clarification. Ben Sirah's grandson translated his work from Hebrew to Greek. But even, listen to this now, even in the original Hebrew, Sirah, though retaining Hebraic thought, integrates Hellenistic thoughts and sayings into parts of his work. So even during his era, when Hebrew was still a common literary language, he uses aspects of Greek culture to communicate what he wants to say. In other words, the Greek people are influencing the Jewish people. And this wasn't necessarily a bad thing in his mind. Now here's the big text. This one is very important for the region, for the culture of the Jewish people, and for maintaining the Jewish religion in Jesus' day and a little bit before then among those Jews who were abroad and not natively living in Judea and Samaria. The Septuagint, or LXX, which is 70 in Latin numerals, it was the largest Jewish work written during the period of Hellenization. It consisted originally of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah or the Pentateuch, that were translated by 72 scribes, according to legend, which is why it's referred to as 70 in Greek, and represented by the Roman numerals LXX. It was translated first in 300 to 200 BC. And eventually the Greek translations of the writings and the prophets, which are Jewish designations for all the other parts of the Old Testament other than the Pentateuch or the Torah, originally they were compiled afterwards, the writings and the prophets, into the Septuagint in the years following, 300 to 200 BC. So again, the Septuagint met the needs of those Jews who primarily spoke Greek and had lost their use of Hebrew. Aspects of the Old Testament were, as in all translations, revisited now in a Greek light through and within a Jewish context. It is important to note that writers of the New Testament, even the Lord Jesus himself, quote the Old Testament in the Septuagint's rendering. In fact, 2/3 of the Old Testament are in the New Testament. The references of 2/3 of the Old Testament are in the Septuagint's translation. So we know that the New Testament writers were prolifically, often using the Septuagint to get across the doctrines that they were trying to teach about who Jesus is. Some of the examples of these are as following. Matthew 9:13, it quotes Hosea 6:6 from the Septuagint. Luke 4:18, it quotes Isaiah 58:6 and 61:1 in the Septuagint. John 12:38 quotes Isaiah 53 verse 1 in the Septuagint. Acts chapter 7 verses 27 through 28 quotes Exodus chapter 2 verse 14 from the Septuagint. And Acts 13:41 quotes Habakkuk chapter 1 verse 5 from the Septuagint. There are many more, many more references to the Septuagint in the New Testament. You can find them online. The way that it is determined, by the way, in scholarship, whether these specific references are from the Septuagint and were just translated by the writers of the New Testament straight from the Hebrew into the Greek, is because of particular ways or phrasings that are particular to the way that the translators of the Septuagint chose to write the Old Testament. In other words, if the New Testament writers rendered the Greek directly from the Hebrew, it probably would have been far more literal. And it would certainly have not been word for word what the Septuagint reads. So we know for sure that they're quoting from the Septuagint. Let's see here. Jewish views of Greco-Roman culture in the time of Jesus. And I mentioned before that the Jewish people had bitterness towards the Greco and Roman culture because of Antiochus Epiphanes and what he had done to them. And of course there was certainly bitterness by the Romans because the Jewish people held on to the promises that they would be their own people, that they would have their own land, and that they would be freed from being controlled by a Gentile empire as they had switched hands from one empire to another. So the groups that we have are firstly the Pharisees, which should come to mind very easily to the listeners, since those are a very common group mentioned in the New Testament that opposed Jesus. Now, they were extremely resistant to the pagan Roman culture. They manifested this in being aloof, not interacting with Romans, the unclean Romans, not talking to them, not being in any social circle which they were in. And they were often in the rural areas of Judea. So they really didn't have to have many interactions with the Romans, and they made sure of that. The Sadducees. Many of the Sadducees were of the priestly families who lived in Jerusalem, and these priestly families bought their way into the priesthood. In other words, it's not primarily based off of Levitical bloodlines as much as who can pay the most to the current Gentile empire ruling the land. So many of them paid their way into higher positions in the priesthood and kind of got cozy with the Romans. They became very comfortable around them. The Romans were seen as the Persians and the Greeks were at one point as the upper class by many people in the Near East, as this cultured way of thinking, this cultured way of living. And so the Sadducees, many of them, embraced this idea of appeasing the Romans and even viewing the Romans as a cultured people. We can take advice from them. We can adopt some of their ways of thinking into our life. They could help us. The Zealots were the exact opposite of that. They hated the Romans and violently opposed them and expressed them. They were known as a group of assassins. The Essenes were an enclosed community who were trying to return to the old Jewish ways and maintain the use of Hebrew, though they still did use Aramaic and Greek, as was demonstrated in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they were the most isolated from Hellenization, even more isolated than the Pharisees. Hellenized Jews, they were Jews from abroad who lived among the nations, who couldn't avoid adopting Greek culture because of life and trade, as I mentioned before. So they were the least despising of the Greeks and the Romans. And here, of course, we have the Jesus movement, or the Way. Their master, Jesus of Nazareth, taught them that his mission was to the children of Israel, but he made it clear that his heart was for the Gentiles also. He did not hate the Romans, and he taught them not to hate the Romans, not to have hatred for Gentiles and their ways of thinking. And he knew who he was as a Jew, and that he was coming to restore the kingdom of Israel. He was not establishing another worldly empire, another Roman empire, another Persian empire, but he was coming with the kingdom of Almighty God. And he was coming to redeem Israel. This was the plan, he taught, from the beginning of what God would do with Israel. He was the Messiah, the King of the Jews. The people of the Way clearly saw the Greeks, the people of the Way clearly saw the Greek of the Septuagint as being made holy and used it, as we talked about. 2/3 of the Old Testament quotes in the New Testament are from the Septuagint. They saw Koine Greek as holy and used it within the New Testament to express the gospel of Jesus Christ. You know, even Paul, who was trained by Rabbi Gamaliel in Jerusalem, was versed in Greek literature and culture and used this knowledge in reaching out to the Gentiles, even using themes of Greek philosophy, common terms, but with a very Jewish message, an origin of a message that's all about God's kingdom in Israel. So we can see from the early Christian community that God does not hate a particular language or a people group, but God desired that the gospel be preached in a language that all could understand, because now in the New Testament, Jesus is coming to sanctify that which was unclean. When in the Old Testament and in the Old Covenant, that which was unclean made the holy unclean. Jesus is reversing the curse and overtaking the devil and his empire. There are a few introductory facts that I want to go over before we go into lesson 2. And they're simple facts about the Greek alphabet. Koine Greek is a more simplified version than its predecessor, Attic Greek. It was used in government, in education, and in the business world. There was a more common, colloquial Koine Greek that was used in everyday conversation, just like there's an everyday conversational English that we used in America and Great Britain. And there's a middle way conversational Koine Greek, which is between that and then the third, the formal literary Koine Greek. Just like in English, we have the way people speak on everyday terms, on educational television, and in academic books. You have the least best English, better English, high-class English. So think of that in those terms. The vocabulary of the New Testament consists of mostly common words in the era. And New Testament writings all dwell within that middle type of Koine Greek, conversational Greek. Now, I want to show you something from this is going to help you. The following shows where in the New Testament which type of Greek lied in what type of book, which books had the best Greek or the more complex Greek, which books were less complex in their Greek. This is from Rodney J. Decker. He was the one that came up with this chart. So you can see the less complex Greek, meaning less complicated, it's easier to translate when you start learning how to translate Greek, is Mark and John, for example. In the middle, you have Paul, Matthew, and on the more complex end, you have Luke, Acts, written by the same person, James, and 1 Peter. That should prepare you enough for entering into the second lesson, in which we will go into the details of the Greek, Koine Greek alphabet. I'm your instructor, Matthew Foley.